Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the FinTV podcast. I'm here today with Lora Cecere, who is a thought leader who really doesn't need much of an introduction, founder of Supply
Thank you.
Chain Insights. Lora, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, my pleasure. Always like to talk about supply chain.
It's a great topic, and more importantly, I think now more than ever, it's on everybody's mind, isn't it? If I look back to prior to COVID, people would ask me, "What is supply chain? What do you do? What exactly do you do?" And now, even my next door neighbor's talking about supply chain, and they can tell you all about it because they probably have a gripe with, during the pandemic, whether they could get flour or couldn't get flour, and what does that actually mean for them. So, I guess why don't we start off by talking about the research that you just recently did? There's quite a lot of information that you've packed into the supply chains to admire, and I'm really keen to understand how you came about this research and what are the findings?
So the supply chains to admire research started when clients asked me, what is supply chain excellence and what does good look like? And that sounds like an easy question, but it isn't. And I had worked at a company called AMR Research, which was purchased by Gartner, and there's a methodology called the Gartner Top 25. And the Gartner Top 25 was problematic in 5 really critical ways. One is it is not based on a peer group analysis, so it basically compares all companies together. So like BASF would be compared to Apple, and I just think that's wrong. I think companies need to be compared within a peer group. So all chemical companies, all household products companies, all high-tech companies, to be able to look at who is really driving improvement and outperforming the peer group. That's number one. Number two is I find that all companies want a barometer, and the Gartner Top 25 is really very anchored on companies 5 billion and above. And so companies that were smaller, particularly European companies, wanted to have something that was meaningful for them. So we basically open up for anybody that's doing public reporting that they can be part of the analysis. The third is that the Gartner Top 25 really looked at a short duration, and I find that it takes at least 4 years for a company to drive substantial improvement in performance differences in a peer group. So I wanted it to stretch over time because the patterns of performance stretch over time. 4 is I wanted it to be based upon a balanced scorecard that tied to value. So one of the first things I did was I worked with Arizona State University to say, of all public reporting metrics, what is a small handful of metrics that we could look at and say that if companies focused here, that they could improve market cap or price to book. And so we focus on growth, operating margin, inventory turns, return on invested capital. And the reason why I think those are important is there's tension between those metrics. If I'm going to grow, then I'm probably going to have more inventory. I'm pulling on cash flow. If I only focus on cost versus margin, then I'll throw the supply chain out of balance. And when I grow, then I have to really use assets well. And so return on invested capital helps me at the intersection of growth and return on invested capital and inventory turns and operating margin. So we plot orbit charts for all companies, which basically take these metrics, and we plot improvement and performance against the peer group, and we're judging based upon the patterns. I think the patterns matter. Many times people will look at numbers in a spreadsheet and they won't have the ability to look at the pattern. So for example, a company that is not very resilient will be all over the map. They might make the number 1 year, but not make it in aggregate. And so those are some of the reasons why we started it. Now, as I do it, and this is the 7th year, I learn more and more about corporate performance, about how companies measure, what is value, and what's possible in a peer group. When I first started my work as an industry analyst, I made some bad recommendations. Like, I looked at high tech and electronics in a pharmaceutical company and said, why can't you turn inventory like, high tech and electronics? Every supply chain has a different DNA, so to speak, in terms of what matters in the supply chain and the trade-offs. So that's a little bit about the background. And so we make it public, and it's based all on data. So the Gartner Top 25 is 50% opinion. And oh, by the way, the supply chain leaders' opinions don't match the data, which is another conundrum. So it's all data driven, and it's done annually, and we try to do it based upon metrics that we can get off a balance sheet, so we can do it globally for all public companies.
I think it's really innovative that you thought, you'd say, well, it's innovative, but now that you explain it, it seems very logical to look at a company within their peer group as opposed to comparing a chemical company to an automotive company. You'd have thought that other people would have thought that through beforehand as well. What was it? Was there anything surprising that you found there?
I found that, I'm an old gal and I've been in the supply chain market a long time. The companies that I thought were top performing were not top performing. My first book, I really, highlighted a few companies as supply chain leaders. When I got into the orbit chart analysis, I found that many of those companies had thrown themselves out of balance through M&A or, perhaps a program that didn't work. And I hadn't been as true to my audience about reporting factual data as I should have been. And as I, try to be much more focused on, being a data-driven, I find more and more patterns, and I find companies I wouldn't have ever thought of as supply chain leaders. So for example, in this particular work, 4% of companies are able to drive performance better than their peer group in the 4 metrics that I talked about, and have a faster rate of improvement. One of them is Sleep Number. Now, I would never have thought about Sleep Number as a supply chain top performer, just wasn't on my radar. Furniture, not necessarily, the top of everybody's list in terms of looking for a top supply chain performer, but they don't sell beds, they sell outcomes, they sell wellness, and they've really focused on the customer experience through their store and the design of their store. It's a great case study of supply chain leadership. When I first did it, I grouped personal products with household products, and I missed the pattern of L'Oreal. Personal products turn at about 2.5 turns a year, whereas household products are 4 times that. So if you group personal products with household products, you'll miss, some of the leaders. So I have learned that I was not a good barometer, even though I had been an analyst 10 years before I did this, and that there's a lot of value for being data-driven.
Well, it speaks volumes to using, I guess, the antiquated methodologies that perhaps analysts were using beforehand to judge companies may not be in line with what the market really is demonstrating, is it?
Well, and so much of it is ego driven, right? We have so many conferences and people get on stage and beat their chest, and we don't hold them accountable of, did they drive value or did they really outperform their peer group? And so I just think that there needs to be a litmus test to help supply chain leaders to drive progress.
A data-driven litmus test at that, because
Right.
those are the operative words there. You're not giving an opinion per se. You might be putting a narrative on the facts that you've discovered, but at the end of the day, the facts will speak for themselves. How does this equate to, say, how the world has changed in terms of the pace of change, the disruption? I've been in so many countless meetings, I'm sure you have too, where some big established companies will say, we didn't see these guys coming. We didn't see, these disruptors coming in and taking our market share. Could it be because they were looking at antiquated, old-fashioned sort of litmus tests versus the kind of things that you're doing now?
I think there are 3 things that come to mind as you ask me this question. One is we're very focused on product innovation, but not really innovation on business models. Amazon was a new business model. Sleep Number is a new business model. A Dollar Shave Club sold at very high multiples, and I would argue that, P&G or Unilever could have invented Dollar Shave Club, but
Mm-hmm.
there are no mechanisms within a company to really drive new business models. I was talking to a company the other day who makes chocolate, and their product is phenomenal coming out of their factory, and I'm like, why don't you sell, chocolate right out of the factory, door to door, right? Well, there's nothing that really allows the evolution of new business models. So that's number one. Number two is process innovation. There's not a lot of incentive for process innovation. In cross-functional alignment against the customer, I find most companies don't even know who their customer is or what drives the customer. And most of our processes are inside out. They're very focused on transactions and balance sheets, not necessarily moving market to market. And right now, what is happening with what I call the hammer and the dance of COVID, where we have the lockdowns and then we slowly get out of our homes and we do the dance and then we have a lockdown. What happens is that the supply chain changes market to market. And so if we're insular and we only focus on the enterprise and making the functions within the enterprise efficient, we'll always have empty shelves and we will not really be able to seize opportunities. Does that help?
Yeah, completely. Absolutely. And let's talk about COVID. Obviously, it's, where we're living at the moment and with no end in sight per se. What are the opportunities that have come out of COVID or that can come out of COVID? Potentially a redesign of supply chain, introducing new business models?
Well, I had COVID. It's nasty. And I hope no one listening has COVID and that their families are healthy, first of all. Don't take any risk. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. However, I find in my research that companies are far more collaborative and appreciative of supply chain capabilities as part of the pandemic. We weren't ready for the pandemic. Our supply chain processes are woefully inadequate. The pandemic is shining a light on those processes, and so people are feeling some pain around inbound visibility, the fact that they can't get air freight. We've always assumed we can expedite and get air freight, but air freight's just not available. We don't have a lot of bellies of planes. And when it is available, it's really too costly. And so I'm working with a number of companies that are like, I used to fly my products, but I can't afford to anymore. So I'm going to have to, do something different. Maybe I don't produce those products for that particular region. So more collaborative on product platform assortments, what should be in the line, and then the evolution of new business models. What I think COVID gives us an opportunity is to build better. Mm-hmm. We've been sort of asleep at the switch, implementing transactional systems, making functional silos very efficient, not really making the supply chain very effective, not really serving the customer. I think this opens up a window of opportunity for people to really embrace new ways of working outside in, starting with the customer, translating consumption data, aligning to the markets, and to be far more nimble and responsive to the needs market to market, including the suppliers. We've done a lot of work around financial reengineering, elongating payables, tax efficiency, business process outsourcing. And that really has given us a lot of ineffective behaviors to manage sourcing, right? And, sourcing is really critical and there's a lot of disruption. And so I think that we're going to also become better trading partners. Business process outsourcing of invoices is horrific for suppliers. And 60, 90 days payables, the cost of capital. I think we're going to become better trading partners.
The people that I interview, they tell me that, I feel like we've gone through phases, right? So when COVID hit, There was the the oh crap moment, the panic, the what do we do now? This is unprecedented. Then there was the okay, we've got this. We're supply chain professionals. Let's go back to basics. Again, going back to what you say, yes, the COVID situation has been absolutely devastating to people, to businesses, to the economy, to governments, et cetera. And it's not going away anytime soon. One thing that is very clear is that it has exposed certain cracks in supply chains. It has
Yes.
exposed certain supply chains for maybe covering up something that was, not functioning very well beforehand, whatever you want to call it, but it's exposed certain cracks. Let's talk about the redesign of supply chain, the opportunity to create a better business model. Do you think it offers the possibility of not just looking at better processes, but more sustainable business models, more, disruptive business models, not just looking at the old-fashioned business models, looking at new companies, the way they've operated, this out of the supply chain box thinking? What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely think it's an opportunity for new business models. There's so much opportunity, and supply chain sits in the middle of enablement, whether it's contactless shopping
Mm-hmm.
or 3D printing based supply chains, or uh, more sustainable reuse supply chains, circular economy. Because not only with COVID are we struggling with the pandemic and wearing masks in our homes, but we also have record unemployment and lots of issues with stimulus checks and the management of money. So the dollar conscious shopper offers a lot of opportunity. In 2007, with the downturn of the economy, we saw the evolution of, the dollar retail outlet, and we really haven't fully explored, the circular economy, the dollar conscious shopper, being able to get things to people's doorsteps, disintermediation to the degree that we can. So retail, lots of business models. We'll start to get perpetual inventory signals in the retail store because we'll need to be able to track on time. The whole manufacturing world is a great opportunity for us to invest in manufacturing, to be able to look at how do we run things better so that we don't have socially distant outages, but also how do we use the signals on the factory floor to be smarter? Think
Mm-hmm.
about all of the pumps, motors, valves, Internet of Things, PLC, all those signals that are out there that are talking, but we're not picking them up. And so digital manufacturing is a great opportunity for us to do things like the redesign of maintenance, or the sensing, or the redefinition of production planning. Sourcing, right? The network of networks. Right now, companies communicate through EDI, which is a lot like old-fashioned postal mail, right? It's 2 to 3 days to get it there. I open an EDI, it's not bi-directional, it's expensive. So new business models to be able to connect and really drive interoperability. So there's lots of opportunities if we can just get out of our way of traditional thinking.
you know, Before COVID, all we talked about as a business, as an organization, we exist to help people connect with each other, to cut through the hype and noise around digital transformation. That's all we talked about, digital transformation. Why is it not living up to the hype? Why is it failing so much? And what we found is that a lot of the failures are down to leadership challenges or cultural issues. Is that something that you found in your studies? Can you speak to, successful businesses that are doing well? What are they doing differently from a leadership or cultural perspective?
Well, first of all, when people talk to me about digital transformation, I say, what do you mean? Right? And they look at me like, aren't you the dumbest analyst in the world that you don't know what I mean, right? But it doesn't have a definition. And I find many times people's definition of digital transformation is doing what they did yesterday faster or without paper. Well, and that's just stupid, because 96% of supply chains are stuck. And they're stuck because we focused on making silos within the organization very efficient, very insular, and very self-serving. And we have a very narrow view of integration versus interoperability, harmonization, synchronization of signals. And what's happening is technology allows us to move past traditional planning into decision support. Supply chains respond, they don't sense. We don't use unstructured data. Tremendous opportunity. So I define digital transformation as rethinking the atoms. So whether it's recycled materials, 3D printing, should I produce that product or should it be a service? Rethinking the atoms of the supply chain and rethinking the electrons. So how do I move information meaningfully from role to role to be able to drive better insights? And how do I do that outside in, from the market to the sourcing market, to be able to be much more effective? And atoms and electrons can be redefined in so many fun ways. But when we only focus on making yesterday's processes faster and paperless, it's a missed opportunity. So, when ERP vendors talk to me about digital transformation, I laugh. I'm like, this is not about transactions. This is not about the enterprise. This is about how do I move insights to be able to power opportunities and to be able to align the organization for value. And I think we got off on the wrong foot because, everybody's heard digital transformation, everybody jumped on the bandwagon. People didn't really define it. They didn't really think about the art of the possible. And so we had, kind of this heightened interest, and then it fell off right before COVID. But right now, what's happening as we expose all the warts and holes of the supply chain, people are like, wow, that's a good opportunity for digital transformation. And there's more incentive to understand the art of the possible. Long answer, sorry for that.
No, it's brilliant. I mean, it's exactly what we found. Digitization for the sake of digitization. It's sort of, can I just make this faster, and without answering the question of what am I trying to serve? Who am I trying to serve? What am I trying to solve? Where does the customer sit in all of this? Isn't this, I would guess, this is more business transformation. Digital is just the vehicle, isn't it? And I think that most people just digitize for the sake of digitization.
Right.
With regards to the supply chains of the future, where we're headed, do you think that the companies that invest in digital without solving their processes have a chance? Or do you think that, and here's a second question, how guilty are the analysts and the consultants in selling the hype of digital without looking to solve the real problem here, which is the business and the business value?
Okay, those are two pretty deep questions. So I'm going to take your second one first. I think consultants and analysts always find a new slope to ride. And I think a company like IBM is much better at marketing than delivery. And, they really pushed, digital transformation. McKinsey, they have to have something to open up the boardroom, right? Okay, guilty is charged, right? But the other thing that I think we have not been honest with ourselves is we don't have best practices. If we had best practices, 96% of companies would not be stuck. And so we must be honest with ourselves that we're only on the third generation of supply chain professionals, and that we must learn from the past, unlearn, to rethink what the possibilities of the future could be. And the biggest obstacle is our gray matter. And if we do not charter to really rethink to build better, somebody else is going to steal our market, or we're going to miss an opportunity. And that doesn't mean that, long-term brands are going to go out of business, but you're going to miss opportunities. And that's, sad. So I think we as professionals have got to change our game, I always laugh and say, you know, consultants have the answers. And I, as an analyst, I'm trying to figure out the questions to ask. I don't think we have good answers. I think we need to focus on how do we get smart about the questions to ask to be able to harness new value.
So why don't we have best practices? Why are only 4% of the companies outperforming their peers?
It's a great question. I'll tell you my observation, and this is the subject of my new book. You know, 1982 was the evolution of supply chain as a practice of source, make, and deliver together. First time it was ever written. We've had a lot of logistics, right? You know, so logistics won wars, but logistics doesn't really have the core elements of manufacturing and the combination of direct materials to manufacturing and conversion. So it's new. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, when I was a first generation supply chain pioneer, they were regional supply chains, right? You know, it was really a local area, right? We ran our factories, we served our markets, it was very contained. The evolution of the multinational global supply chain, as frictionless borders happened and people chased lower labor costs and we went after global markets, organizations became much, much larger and much more political. And lots of people didn't really define supply chain excellence. And you might think, well, that's trivial, but it's so important to define what is supply chain excellence and tie it to strategy and design the supply chain. Only 9% of companies design their supply chains actively. Now, I'm a chemical engineer. I couldn't get out of school without designing heat exchangers and distillation columns. And I'm appalled at how few companies design their supply chains, the flows, form and function of inventory, how they make decisions, the role of governance. And we didn't do the basics. We really just jumped in and said, we're going to be a global company now. And we shipped a lot of things around the world, but not really very effectively. And we focused only on safety stock, not on form and function of inventory. And we looked at financial reengineering because what CFO ever learned supply chain basics, right? And so we moved money around, right? And we basically penalized suppliers, pushed cost and waste back in the supply chain, didn't really work on our own capabilities. Those are some thoughts. And it's good to talk to you today.
No, I appreciate you being on here. I appreciate you having a chat with us about your research, which sounds absolutely really enlightening. I think our viewers would really have some very good insight about the supply chain that they're in and how they measure up and what advice that you can give them with regards to the supply chains to admire. Thank you so much for being on here, Laura. I appreciate you taking the time. And hopefully we'll see you because you're going to be speaking soon at one of our events. So we'll see you there. Thank you so much.
Okay,
No problem.
bye now.
Bye-bye.